All right, guys. Well, it's good to be with you tonight. See some familiar faces and some unfamiliar faces, which is always a good thing, too. We're going to be in Mark chapter 8, verses 34 to 38 tonight. So you can turn there. We'll get to that in just a minute. But there was a video online. It's still online, but it came out a few years ago. And it was about an experiment that these people did called the marshmallow test. So maybe some of you guys have seen this. It's pretty funny. So in the video, what they do is they place these kids individually in a room, and they sit them at this table. There's nothing really else going on in the room, and they put a plate in front of them on this table, and on the plate is a single marshmallow. And what's great about this is the adult that comes in the room gives them instructions, and they say, you can eat this marshmallow right now, or if you wait, you can eat a second marshmallow. I'll give you a second marshmallow if you can hold out eating this first marshmallow until I get back. And so basically what you get is this hilarious footage of these kids as they're sitting and this big fluffy marshmallow is right in front of them, and they're contemplating, like, do I eat it now? What do I do? And you get this hilarious footage of their reactions. And so there was a kid who looked like he was just in physical pain as he's looking at the marshmallow in front of him. He's struggling so much because he wants to eat it. You have kids who were bringing the marshmallow up to their mouth and up to their nose and smelling it because, again, they wanted it so bad. And then you had kids who just kind of went for it. So one little girl, basically she ate the marshmallow to its core. So if you think of someone who eats an apple to the core, that's what it looked like. She did that in hopes of when the adult would come back, that the adult wouldn't notice. So she ate it to the core and just kind of put it on the plate and then waited until the adult got back. Obviously noticeable. And then my favorite reaction was a girl who just went for it. The adult gave her the instructions, you can wait. If you wait, I'll give you a second marshmallow. And before the adult even gets out the door, the little girl just takes it. She's like, I'm eating it right now. And so the end of the video is great because it's just her taking her plate off the table and just heading out the door because there just wasn't even, the second marshmallow just wasn't even an option for her. But what I think is intriguing about this video in particular is a couple things, a couple principles that relate to our human nature. So number one, I think the first principle is that we want instant gratification. If something is placed before us and it looks good to us, then we want it now. We have a hard time waiting for something greater, especially if it means that we have to endure some sort of suffering right now. And the second thing I think this video shows us is that we ultimately don't want an authority figure telling us what we can and can't do. If we want it bad enough, we're going to do it. Just like these kids. If they wanted the marshmallow bad enough, they were just going to eat it. And that might have meant not getting the second marshmallow, but they could satisfy their immediate desire. And so, obviously, every analogy falls short, but I think the principles that come from this video relate to what we're going to be talking about today. So, again, we're going to be in Mark chapter 8, verses 34 through 38. So if you have your Bible, you can turn there. It's on the screen. And starting in verse 34, it says, "And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, 'If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would lose his life, or whoever would save his life, will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels.'" And so tonight, what we want to start by doing is looking at the context for this verse, because it's really important that we look at the context to understand what this verse is actually saying. And so what we see happening immediately before this particular passage is Jesus is foretelling his death and resurrection to his disciples for the very first time. And so he tells them things like he must suffer. He tells them that he's going to be rejected by elders and chief priests and scribes. basically the people of power in that day. And he also says he must be killed, and that he's going to rise again on the third day, which is, it's really interesting because for us, it's really easy to understand what's going to happen. We have the full narrative. We can flip to the end of the gospel and see what he's talking about here, but his disciples are perplexed. Right here is a man who Peter has just confessed as the Christ, and so they think of Jesus as a ruler. They think of him as this messianic ruler, and so he's saying things like he must suffer, he must be rejected and killed, and it's leaving the disciples confused. They must think, like, why would a ruler like this be subjected to that kind of treatment? Or thoughts like, surely if he wanted to, he could get out of this. Like, we just confess him as Christ, we think of him as this ruler, he could get out of it if he wanted to. But Jesus knows what his mission is, right? He knows that he must be the atonement for sins. He knows that his mission here on earth is necessary. So when Peter takes him aside and rebukes him when he says these things, Jesus rightfully replies, saying, "Get behind me, Satan." Which seems like a pretty big deal because it is. He was rebuking the fact that Peter and basically the rest of the disciples are setting their mind on the things of man and not on the things of God. So basically what he's saying is to rebuke him of this mission that he's on is satanic. That's what Satan would want, is that this doesn't go through. Jesus wouldn't fulfill his mission. And so, that's what he's saying here. And he's saying that there's going to be a cost that he's going to inevitably face. And he has to do it to fulfill his mission. And so, why this context is important is because it leads into what we're going to be talking about in this text. Jesus is already showing his disciples something vitally important in this text. He's showing them the value of self-denial. Because Jesus could have just come to earth and not fulfilled his mission. He could have just come and lived here. He could have not come at all. But he doesn't do those things. He knows that he will face sufferings. He knows he's going to face rejections and ultimately murder, and he still goes through with it. And something really important for us to understand here too is that Jesus is both fully man and fully God. And that's a whole nother discussion. It's a whole nother night we could talk about that. But the fully man piece of that, Jesus knows he's going to endure these things, and he's experiencing this as a man, and we see that pretty clearly the night before he goes to the cross. Like, it's a real struggle for him, but he denies himself. He knows he must go to the cross, he denies himself, and he's doing this, he's telling his disciples this because he's going to ask them to deny themselves as well. So we're going to look at the text. I'm going to give you guys a main idea of this text. It's just a summary of the text basically in one sentence that when you see this text, you can think about it. And so the main idea for it is following Jesus comes with a cost, but it's absolutely worth it. And to support this main idea, I want to give you guys two different main points. Number one is that Jesus calls his followers to a disassociation. It's a big word. He calls his followers to a disassociation with themselves, or we could say that Jesus calls his followers to self-denial. And then point number two is that Jesus calls his followers to an association with him, or we could say a confession of allegiance to Christ. And so let's look at the first main point that Jesus calls his followers to a disassociation with themselves. Jesus begins in verse 34 by giving a conditional statement. And you guys are probably aware of what a conditional statement is, but just in case you aren't, I'll give you a reminder. A conditional statement is an if-then statement. And basically, in a conditional statement, a condition has to be met for it to be fully realized, for it to become true. So Jesus says to his disciples here, if anyone would come after me, and there's an implied then here, then let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. So you can see that Jesus is laying out a condition. He's saying that truly coming after him is conditional upon one denying themselves and one taking up their cross and following him. And what I want to be very, very clear about here is Jesus is not saying that this is how you earn salvation. We know from other parts in the Bible, Ephesians 2, that it's by grace through faith. He's not saying you earn salvation this way, but what he is saying, he's making very clear that one cannot truly come after him if they are not willing to do these things. They're not willing to deny themselves and take up their cross. So it's clear that we need to spend some time looking at these things. They're very important. We need to pay attention to them. So the first thing that Jesus requires is that a person deny themselves. And so what does it mean to deny oneself? I think this is one of those texts that we look at a lot, but we don't often zoom in and actually look at what these different things mean that Jesus is calling his disciples to do. So the word translated here means to disassociate oneself with someone. And what's interesting here is that it's used in a reflexive manner, meaning that the disassociation is happening with oneself. And so that's where we got that name point from. It's reflexive. It means to forget oneself, to forget one's own interests, and to follow someone else. So if we're honest, we look at this and we don't really like this requirement at all, because it requires something of us that we don't really want to do. Our flesh screams when we hear this definition. We want to be rulers of our own lives. We want to guide our own destinies. We want what we want, when we want it, how we want it, right? I think we can all relate to that. Most of us have grown up in a culture where we've been encouraged to validate ourselves versus deny ourselves. And a part of this, too, is just our sinful nature. Our sinful nature tells us to follow our flesh, to follow ourselves. But the problem with that is, and Jesus makes this clear in other parts of the Bible too, is that one cannot follow themselves and follow Jesus. It's not, he makes it very clear, it's not possible. It's either one or the other. And so what Jesus calls for here then is a radical abandonment of one's own identity, one's own self-determination. And it's not just a denial of something to the self, though it does mean that as well. So what I mean by that is, like, Lent would be an example of that. Like, I'm going to give up pot for Lent. I'm giving up something to myself. It's not just that, that's a part of it. More importantly, it's the denial of the self itself. It's an understanding that this life is not mine to live for me. It's an understanding that it's a disassociation of Nick with self and association of Nick with Jesus. It's an abandonment that I'm to guide my own destiny and a rather submission to Jesus to guide me. And he's making it clear here then that if you are to follow him, if you're to come after him, you must abandon yourself. That's what he's saying in this first part of it. The second thing Jesus requires is that one take up his cross. And so to think about this rightly, we need to think about what the cross is, or was. And the cross was an extremely cruel and dehumanizing instrument. It was used to torture people, and not just that, it was used to shame them, and typically criminals. It was a symbol of Roman oppression. And so we lose this a little bit because we hang, crosses in our houses, which is great. I'm not saying that's a bad thing at all. But for us, it's a reminder of something very sacred. It's a reminder of something that was done on our behalf. In Mark's day, this is something very raw and something very real to them, because it's a sign of oppression. It's something to be feared. It was an instrument of torture. It was a bloody, slow, suffocating process that led to sure death, just an eventual death. And basically, it was completely inhumane. And so the people of Mark's day this would be very, very clear to them what he's saying, and very important for them to listen to. So what is he saying here? He's saying that the image of the cross signifies a total claim of allegiance on Jesus' disciples. He's saying that basically when one took up a cross, it was a one-way trip. You didn't come back from the cross. And the same is true here. It's a total allegiance to Jesus. And it's not merely a call to endure hardship, though again, that is a big piece of it. But it's also being willing to die in total allegiance to Jesus. It's a total commitment to God and His will, no matter what comes at you. And you can see the denial of self in that. Discipleship of Jesus is an all-in, no turning back type of life. And Jesus is making this parallel here then between the cross and following Him. He's saying that you will suffer for my sake. You will be perhaps persecuted for my sake. You may even die for my sake. And He's laying it out there saying, are you willing to do that? Because the first piece of this, the self doesn't like that. The self is not willing to do those things. So He's saying, are you willing to do that? And if so, take up your cross. But what's astonishing here, and that we'll continue to see as we go through this, is that what He's saying is this is the way to true freedom. He's saying cross-bearing actually leads to true liberation. And that's something that's just, it's confusing. Because it wouldn't seem that that would be the case. And the third thing that Jesus requires is to follow Him. And this is pretty straightforward here. The words follow me are the same as the words at the beginning of the sentence, come after me. It's the same word, and this action just means to join one as a disciple, to become a disciple, to follow one who precedes you. And so He's saying that if you're going to follow Him, you're going to become a disciple. You're going to join this one-way life. You're going to deny yourself and take up your cross. That's what it looks like to follow Him, to be a disciple of Him. And if at this point you're looking at these things and you're kind of discouraged with where you're at, you're going, how do I do this? I want to just offer you some encouragement, offer you a little bit of comfort in the fact that as Christians, we're growing in these things. This is part of what we would call progressive sanctification, the ongoing transformation of becoming like the image of Christ. And we don't do this on our own. We do this by the help of the Spirit. So the question here is, He lays these things out, and right away, they're probably not really enticed by this. Like, this sounds like a hard life. So why follow Him? And Jesus anticipates that question, and He answers. He gives this earth-shattering statement. He answers the question of why. And He says, for whoever would lose his life, or whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. And so what He's doing here is He's giving a reason by explaining the two different lifestyles that He's alluded to previously. He's saying that whoever chooses to live their life centered around themselves will lose eternal life in the next. So it's a big deal. Jesus has really just upped the stakes, if you will, here. He's saying an eternity hangs in the midst. An eternity with Him hangs in the midst. And that is vitally important because the one who refuses to deny themselves and rather chooses to live for themselves, He's saying, will not inherit eternal life with Him. He will lose it. And that's a sobering truth for us to hear today. I think we read over language like that in the Bible and we don't think about it that much. But this has massive, massive implications. But He's also giving words of assurance here. He's saying that whoever loses his life for Jesus' sake and the Gospels will save it. He's alluding to the other life He was just talking about. Those who will deny themselves, those who would take up the cross and follow Him. And it may be difficult. There is a cost to pay. It's losing your life, but it doesn't even compare to what you will gain. The eternity that hangs in the midst, an eternity in heaven with God. again, this can be difficult for us if we're really honest, because we're tempted to want to experience heaven on earth. We're tempted to give into the idea of instant gratification, and it can be really, really strong sometimes. But Jesus is pointing to an eternity of perfection. He's pointing to an eternity of gratification. He's talking about the reality of an eternity spent with Him, where there is fullness of joy and pleasures forevermore. Another verse that we can't just read past. Fullness of joy and pleasures forevermore. And so we need to remember that when we're looking at these things, when we're contemplating self-denial and taking up our cross. We need to remember how good this promise is, this truth is, and the assurance that He offers. And He gives further reason next to help us. He says, "For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul?" Again, sometimes the world looks good to us, right? We want to do exactly what Jesus says is not profitable. Namely, gain the whole world. Again, it's about us. It's about how we want to live our life. We want to rule over our life. We want to gain everything we could possibly hope for. And then we're tempted to pursue these different things, right? We know them well. Power, status, big one for these days, followers on social media, any temporal pleasures, money. It's a big thing for us. And guys, I mean, it's a struggle. We live in Kentucky now, which is crazy. But Mindy and I, we go to this restaurant that we found by accident. And it's this restaurant that is just, it's a really cool place. There's live music, there's patios. It's right along this river in Kentucky. And throughout the time you eat, you get to see these like boats that are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, so over $1 million, come in and come out. And I just remember there was a week that had just been really hard at seminary and at work and everything like that. And we came on a Friday. I remember sitting there and just watching these boats come in and out and seeing these people had been out all day. It was a Friday. They'd been fishing and grilling on their yachts and tanning. And I was just so tempted in that moment to go, that's the life. Like, that's where life is found. Like, what am I doing at seminary, training to tell a world that's hostile to Jesus about Jesus? Like, this looks so good right in front. And it's interesting how strong that temptation can be, to think that life is found in things like that. And so I'm not saying, we interpret these things wrong all the time, I'm not saying that boats are bad or name it as bad, but to find life in something like that, Jesus is saying is futile, it's folly. And thankfully, a couple minutes later, I was watching just like the sunset, and I was reminded that like I can gain the whole world. Best boat I want. I can have this life where I can go out on a Friday and I just collect a paycheck while other people are working for me. I could have all the money in the world, and it would not be enough. It would not touch what Jesus has offered us. He's saying that looking for life in those things is folly. He's saying that even if you were to gain these things that seem profitable, by definition, are supposed to profit you, wouldn't actually do that. They would give us no profit at all. Why? Because they would forfeit our soul. Even if we had the whole world, we could not exchange it for our soul. We would long for more. We would long for an eternity with God without maybe even knowing it. And you see that all around you every day. People who are longing for something more, and they don't know what it is, so they try and find it in other things, and really, they were created to live in unity with God forever. No amount of followers of money, power, status, pleasure in this world is worth giving up your soul, and it's not even close. What you can notice here is that Jesus has no problem saying it wouldn't be profitable to you. The stakes are high, and he makes it clear that gaining this whole world is actually empty. Those seem profitable is actually empty. And so why do we fail to see this? I think we do. I think we're tempted to believe things a lot. I think we fail to see this is because we don't believe it. I'm convinced that we don't see this clearly primarily because we're not in the Word consistently. I'm not speaking for everyone, but when we're tempted to believe things, we're not in the Word consistently. Seeing what Jesus has to offer is so much better than gaining the whole world, than what we could imagine. And so that's the first application really for you guys tonight is simple, and you've heard it 1,000 times, but read your Bible. Because the way that you continue to see that self-denial is good is by continuing to see that there's something better than yourself to live for, namely God. The way that you continue to see that cross-bearing, taking up your cross is actually worth it, is to see that by it, you're actually liberated. There's true freedom that comes with it. The way that you continue to see that gaining followers and money and power, popularity, whatever you could want for yourself, gaining the whole world will actually leave you empty and would cause you to lose your soul, is by continuing to see that abandoning those things and rather living for Christ is where true life is actually found. And the only way that you're going to continue to see those things is if you are consistently in the Word of God. And I'm sure you guys are probably going through this right now. I know you're going through a Battling Unbelief series. I mean, the main theme that's probably going to keep popping up in that is you need to keep seeing the glory of God, to fight these things by seeing that God is so much better. And I want to stress this because this is why Bible reading is not just a thing to do to check it off your list for the day. It's not something that your leaders just want you to do so that you'll continue to grow morally, you'll behave well. It's because it's where true life is found. This living and active Word, which is what it says about itself, is true. Living and active Word offers a qualitatively better message than any noise that comes at you today. And you guys, especially at your age, experience so much noise, so much more noise than some of your leaders did when we were in high school because of social media. But this book offers a qualitatively better message than anything that's going on. It shows you how you were created to live, namely in union with God. And what's interesting is that as you continue to be in the Word, you start to see that self-love and self-rule and those different things are absolutely foreign to the gospel of Jesus Christ. So you must read this book. And what's interesting, I think you guys would agree with, is what I find is when we're not in the Bible, not in this book, and these temptations pop up, it's in those times when we look at those temptations and think, it doesn't seem that bad. Like, yeah, maybe life is fun in that thing of this thing. It's dangerous ground to walk on. But it's when we're in the Bible and temptations pop up and we can look at them and say, what do you have to offer me that I don't already have in Christ? Like, nothing. Nothing can touch it. When we're filled with the amazing truths of the Bible and the gospel, we can look at these temptations and say it's not even enticing to us. Right? That's where we want to be. We don't want to be in the place where it's just like, I don't know. We want to be able to look at things and go, it just doesn't even entice me because of what I have in who I am in Christ. And so, read your Bible. The second main point is that Jesus calls his followers to an association with himself. And we could say, an association is kind of a weak word, but it's just keeping with the theme. We could say a Christian confession calls his followers to a confession of allegiance to him. And so in verse 38, he says, "For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." This verse is very, very important, and I want us to note a couple things here. Number one is that Jesus is claiming authority. Right? He's calling himself the Son of Man. He's saying that he will come in the glory of the Father with the holy angels. And so why is this important? It's important because of what he says next. He says, "Whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed." What Jesus is doing here is referring to judgment. And this is something that a lot of people don't like to talk about. Even churches kind of step around this. But what he's doing is he's claiming authority and final judgment. We have to pay attention to when the Bible refers to judgment because it's real. If you believe in the Bible, heaven is real, hell is real, judgment is real, you can't read the Bible and dismiss that. You just can't. I mean, you can make arguments for it, but arguments that have massive logical and theological gaps in them. Judgment is real. That's sobering news for us. And so what Jesus is saying here refers to what he's been saying over the past few verses. He's referring to those two different types of lifestyles again. He's saying whoever's ashamed of him, he will be ashamed of in judgment. The lifestyle of self-rule, not self-denial. The lifestyle of clinging to the world. It's the lifestyle that leads to losing their soul. That's what Jesus is saying here. And he's saying that he will be ashamed of the one who's ashamed. So I want you to hear that very clearly, because you're accountable for that. The one who has claimed authority of final judge and final judgment has said that the verdict will be an eternity spent away from him. And that should terrify us if we're living for ourselves. It's sobering news. Again, here on the flip side, he offers assurance. He's saying that the life of self-denial, the life of taking up our cross and following him, that's the life that leads to eternity spent with him. And what's interesting here is the word ashamed is the same word used in Romans 1:16, which some of you guys probably know that verse by heart because of the music group, but it says, "For I am not," this is Paul, he says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew and also to the Greek." Paul's a really good example of how to live for Jesus. Right? This is the life Jesus wants us to live. A life that is not ashamed of him and his words. And if we live this life, following him, denying ourselves, taking up a cross, when it comes to judgment, the one who has authority will give us a verdict that we did not deserve. That he will give us a non-guilty verdict and welcome us into an eternity with him forever. And we can only do this because of what he's done for us, because of what he foreshadowed, that we saw earlier in this text, to his disciples, his life and death and resurrection. We can have, we can spend an eternity in heaven with God because Jesus denied himself. Because Jesus suffered and was rejected and mocked and killed on the cross. And by the power of the Spirit he rose again, taking sin and death, conquering them forever. He's taken our place. He has taken our sin and offered us his righteousness. Every every speck of sin has been washed away. He offers us his righteousness through the shedding of his blood. That's amazing news, guys. That there's nothing like that at all. And when we look at it that way, when we contemplate the truths of the gospel, a life of following Jesus, even though the costs that come with it seems very, very worth it. The costs seem very small. And a one-way life seems very worth it. That's how amazing Jesus is as a Savior. He calls you to live for him by his grace, with the help of the Spirit, knowing that it will lead you to an eternity with him. That's an amazing Savior. And you can ask yourself, what can this world give you that's even close to that? And so that's what I want you to do. I want you to ask yourself, as a kind of second application tonight, ask yourself that question. Who am I living for, and why? Because I know it's hard. A month into school now, maybe even longer, temptations can be strong. Being ashamed of Jesus seems like the easy way to go to protect your reputation. But please ask yourself who you're living for. If it's for yourself, if you're clinging to what this world has to offer, if you want to follow your desires, that's folly. Ask yourself, are you ashamed of Jesus and his words? Or is it for Jesus because you've seen in his word the worth of following? You've seen that in him you already have everything, and that there's nothing that this world can offer you that you don't already have. And you realize, this is so important, you realize that in the end it's not about you anyway. That when you go to be with him in eternity, all the attention's not going to be on you. It's going to be on him. And you realize that, and that brings you joy. I hope that's you. And if it's the first one for you, I would ask you to reconsider. Because eternity, Jesus made it very clear that eternity hangs in the midst. Life is only found in Jesus. And I can only stress to you so much that this life is worth living. I want you guys to read your Bibles and continue to see it for yourself. But it's worth living this life. There's no better way to live. So get in the Word, ask yourself those questions. We're going to do that in a second, discussion questions, but two important words from Jesus for us to contemplate. Let me pray for us. Father, we thank you for this word. We thank you that you've made it very clear to us what you want us to do, how you want us to live in following you. Lord, we thank you that you have given us this great hope that we can follow Jesus, that we wouldn't look at discipleship as a burden, but rather as an amazing promise, an amazing opportunity that's been given to us that we did not deserve. But it's because your Son denied himself and went to the cross and died for our sins that we can follow. That we get offered an eternity spent with you. And I pray that these truths would become so precious to us and not burdensome, that we would look at them and just take joy in the fact that we have everything. Lord, you help us continue to see, as we discuss tonight, your glory in these words. The amazing truths you've given us. We praise you for Jesus. All right. I do have some discussion questions. Is that?
Yep. No, we don't do that anymore.
You guys need? Are you doing hands?
Do you want to go eat?